This is a Stories to be Told podcast. Hi everyone, Tracy DW back again for yet another episode of Stories to be Told, the podcast series. I've been on holiday from my job throughout August as schools were closed and I was able to take a well-earned rest along with other fellow colleagues. I spent my holiday catching up with friends and family members with whom I celebrated yet another birthday, turning another year older, for which I am always grateful. I was also thrilled to wake up on my birthday to a notification that one of my music tracks, He's Alive, had been requested for airplay on Namibia's global radio station, NAM Radio. It was such a lovely present, and I just want to thank everyone who is requesting my music and shout out to the team at NAM Radio who I know are listening and following Stories to be Told with great interest and support. I also had He's Alive reviewed on the Radio Airplay blog as well, so even though I have been lying low in August, things were moving forward in the right direction and my music has been doing the rounds this time, which is great. Now, I have always been grateful for this platform in being able to have a voice and grateful for you as my listeners. I've been doing this podcast series for almost a year now, and some of the content for my episodes I had planned from the start, as the original intention was to use the podcasts to promote the stories. But as time has gone by, this platform has become a vehicle for communicating and sharing with you not just my learning journey about Britain's colonial past, but also its present-day consequences. A couple of months ago, I shared my perspectives about the facts of Canada's secret history with the discovery of mass children's graves, and now, due to what has transpired over the last few weeks, I feel compelled to talk about Afghanistan. Where is Afghanistan? It is a landlocked country at the crossroads of Central and South Asia. It is bordered by Pakistan in the east and south, Iran in the west, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan and Tajikistan in the north, and China in the northwest. Back in the Middle Ages, it was a major route through the Silk Road to China and South Asia, and because of this, it has been subject to many attempts to conquer and or occupy the region, from Alexander the Great all the way up to the US and NATO. Afghanistan's historical significance doesn't go back to just the past 20 years since 9/11, but goes back many centuries. Muslims and Turks began to occupy its land and the surrounding areas from the 10th century, finally culminating in the seizure of Constantinople in 1453, the fall of the Byzantine Empire, and the beginning of the Ottoman Empire. The country experienced many internal disputes, and during the 1800s, Afghanistan went through a process of breaking up into various provinces such as Kabul and Herat, as well as involvement in wars with the Sikhs during the Afghan-Sikh Wars along the border of India, which is now Pakistan today. Britain's involvement with Afghanistan began at this particular time, where it saw these wars and Russia's attempts to invade as a threat to its own interests in India, which was at the time a colony and part of Britain's empire. The First Anglo-Afghan War, 1839-42, saw Britain serving its own interests through restoring the rule of Shah Shuja and the recapture of Kabul. The Second War, 1878-80, was due to the threat of Russian influence in the region, countered through the Treaty of Gandamak in 1879. Now, this is significant because it initiated British control over Afghan foreign policy and Afghanistan's status as a British colony. Its border with British India was finally demarcated between 1894 to 96. The Third War in 1919 was a result of other Central Powers trying to encourage Afghanistan to declare independence from Britain. However, Afghan's then ruler, Amanullah Khan, decided to take the offensive and enter British India. This resulted in the Treaty of Rawalpindi in 1919, which declared Afghanistan as a sovereign and fully independent state. Khan intended to end Afghanistan's isolation from the rest of the world, creating international links and promote reform. The politician Mahmoud Tazi and his wife Soraya were key in instigating legislation to support the education of women and the end of slavery in 1923. However, tribal opposition to Khan's reforms resulted in his abdication in 1929. The assassination of Khan's successor, his cousin Mohammad Nadir Shah, and the tribal revolts of 1944 to 47 during the reign of Khan's son Mohammad Sahi Shah from 1933 to 73 indicates not only the tension between liberal and fundamental ideologies, but also an enduring division amongst the tribal groups who share the same faith but could not agree on a uniformed approach to its interpretation and its practices. Although Britain's empire came to a formal end in 1997, with the transition of Hong Kong being handed back to China, those of us who were born towards the end of the last century and the turn of this one have witnessed during the last 20 years what we have only ever read about in history books, as we saw this colonial pattern play out again in Afghanistan, which had declared independence just over a century before. Foreign powers remove an enemy or threat, declare occupancy and state that they are liberating the population through introducing an ideology that is presented not as an alternative but as best. Now, discussion about the merits of any ideology or which ideology is best is not the focus of this podcast, as we know that ideologies are the fundamental principles that build all human cultures, economies and systems of government, values and practices in every country of the world. The events which transpired in Afghanistan from the 15th of August 2021 onwards has made us all ask the question of how an ideology established for 20 years in a country was able to be extinguished in little more than 2 weeks. You would have to examine the hearts and minds of the Afghan people and think about whether this process of liberation through a change in ideology ever really resolved the deep-rooted divisions about interpretations and practices which may have simply transferred themselves onto this new ideology that they were introduced to. It seems that Britain, along with the US, were trying to reenact what Amanullah Khan had envisioned for his country back in 1919. But if he failed to achieve this with his own people, why did Britain and the US think that they would succeed? The extent to which a population can take ownership of processing an ideology in its own time frame and in its own way is important. An example of this could be explored through whether the Afghan people were able to elect their own leadership and government during the time of US and British occupation. This could have inspired greater confidence and a commitment to their decisions with actions which would bring about consequences, good or bad, from which they could then learn from and therefore take greater responsibility. Based on this learning from their own actions, interpretations and practices evolve, resulting in freely accepting an ideology and in turn acceptance of change. The time frame is also important in questioning whether 20 years was really long enough for a new ideology to develop a potency in engaging the Afghan people of all ages, helping them to find a common ground from which roots and green shoots could grow. With the departure of the US and British forces out of Afghanistan, as well as many of its brightest and highly skilled citizens, are there any green shoots remaining in the country? Will they grow? And under what conditions, and what will they look like? One thing is for certain, and that is that the world's major powers must learn from history and understand that the colonial phenomenon of occupying lands to exploit its natural resources and for ideology's sake firmly belongs in the past. The US, Britain, and all other major world powers now need to come together and reevaluate their roles and responsibilities and define a new kind of politics that is more equitable for sustaining the survival and prosperity of all human life and ensures the preservation of our small planet for future decades to come. If you liked this podcast, then stay on my website or this listening platform and check out my other podcast related to this episode, Constantinople, 1453, A Catalyst for European Change, which will give you a little more context and background to the Middle East's historical significance. Also, From a Whisper to a Scream, Canada's Secret History, which explores the colonisation of Canada and how Western ideology affected the lives of the Indigenous people of that country. And finally, don't forget what I call the heart and soul of the Stories to be Told movement. My stories, or poetic narratives as I always like to call them, Caribbean Wind, Caribbean Rush, Knights at the Round Table, the Berlin Conference 1884, and Gone with the Wind, Macmillan's Speech for Change. All 4 titles are available at storiestobetold.com, as well as our free sample promotion. The links are in the notes of this podcast. Thank you so much for continuing to support these podcasts. Please comment, like, and don't forget to share using the hashtag STBTpodcast. As always, it's a pleasure and a privilege to share my learning journey with you in this podcast, and I encourage you to either begin or continue your own. As we continue to ask the question, history is a matter of fact or perspective. Thanks so much for listening again, and I'll see you on the next page.